Thank you all very much for coming. First of all, an announcement, because maybe some of you folks have questions on very technical things about the bill. We will have our respective staff stay around for a while afterwards if you want to glean from them some really technical information. I thank you all for being here, and particularly I thank my colleagues for being here. Today we introduce the Protecting Community and Preserving the Second Amendment as an amendment to legislation pending. This amendment is a combined effort of many members of the Senate. It's a sensible alternative and a product of Senate deliberation on this issue for a long period of time. It effectively addresses problems that we've seen without burdening law-abiding citizens. We ensure the Second Amendment is protected while taking reasonable steps to strengthen our communities. It authorizes and improves and strengthens NICS to ensure the system has the necessary and relevant records. Second, it would improve prosecution of gun crimes. And third, it provides new tools to law enforcement to fight gun crimes, and it imposes reasonable limits on dangerous operations like Operation Fast and Furious. Fourth, it reauthorizes the Mentally Ill Offender Treatment and Crime Reduction Act without amendments, and ensures that veterans don't, or with amendments, and ensures that veterans don't lose their Second Amendment rights. And finally, the bill reauthorizes the Secure Our Schools program under the COPS program to provide the necessary resources that schools, if they want to make use of it, will have those resources. I want to highlight just a couple provisions. First, prosecution of gun crimes. During the judiciary hearings, we repeatedly heard questions about why the Justice Department prosecutes such few cases of gun crimes. Our amendment addresses this by providing resources to increase federal prosecution of gun violence based upon the successful Project Exile in Richmond, Virginia. This will help put boots on the ground to deal with gun crimes directly. It's modeled after a successful program to make an immediate impact. Another important provision is a study by the National Institute of Justice and the National Academy of Sciences to examine the causes of mass shootings. It simply authorizes a peer-reviewed study to examine the impact of certain factors, including the important issue of violent video games. Finally, our bill also includes provisions designed to strengthen federal law enforcement of lawful gun violators. It modifies existing law to update interstate sale of firearms, repeals burdensome requirements on firearms dealers imposed following Fast and Furious, ensures firearms dealers have access to law enforcement information, and finally updates laws protecting interstate transportation of firearms. So I want to thank my colleagues who are here and colleagues who aren't here for working with us on this legislation, and I'll now turn it over to Senator Cruz, Senator Graham, and Senator Coates, and then we'll answer questions. All of us will be available for questions. Thank you, Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Thank you to everyone for coming and joining us this morning. This issue has captured the nation's attention for the past several months following the tragedy in Newtown. And I know that everyone in the Senate, everyone in Congress, and every American wants to see serious steps taken to stop violent crime and to do everything we can to prevent another horrific tragedy like what happened in Newtown. This bill today is a result of the Senate working like it should. It is a result of extended hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee looking at the problems of violent crime, looking at the challenges of prosecution, and then it is the result of an extensive collaborative process between numerous senators coming together to draft a strong prosecution bill targeted at violent crime. This bill has over 20 co-sponsors, and I believe and I'm hopeful that when it is voted on, that it will receive significant bipartisan support to addressing the issue of violent crime is to focus our resources, our attention on violent criminals, to do everything to protect the innocent among us, and at the same time to safeguard the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens to keep and bear arms. That's exactly what this bill does. It focuses first and foremost on prosecuting violent criminals, and I'd like to highlight a couple of points. Number one, the hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee revealed that current federal law enforcement does not place a priority on prosecuting felons and fugitives who attempt to illegally purchase firearms. In 2010, roughly 48,000 felons and fugitives attempted to illegally purchase firearms. Out of those 48,000, the Obama Justice Department prosecuted only 44. Let me repeat those numbers because those numbers, in my opinion, are quite staggering. Out of 48,000 felons and fugitives who in a single year tried to illegally purchase firearms, the Justice Department prosecuted just 44 of them. In our judgment, that's unacceptable. In one hearing, a police chief yelled at a senator on the Judiciary Committee and said he didn't have time to prosecute paperwork crimes. Well, in my opinion, if a convicted felon or fugitive attempts to illegally purchase a gun, it's not a paperwork crime. And we need to do everything we can to prosecute those individuals and to prevent them from getting firearms to be used in subsequent violent crime. So what this bill does is it creates a task force at the Department of Justice focusing on prosecuting felons and fugitives who attempt to illegally purchase firearms. And it provides $50 million in funding, $10 million a year over 5 years, to do exactly that, to go after, to target our resources where the problem is, and the problem is violent criminals. And so it provides law enforcement resources to prosecute felons and fugitives trying to illegally buy guns. A second component of it provides for national Project Exile. Project Exile was a program that was pioneered under the Clinton administration. And it focused on increasing the federal resources on prosecuting violent gun crimes. If a felon uses a gun in a crime, federal resources are used to prosecute them under federal law. And it proved tremendously successful when it was implemented in Virginia. In the Bush administration, Project Exile was expanded and had significant positive results, focusing federal law enforcement efforts on prosecuting violent crime. Unfortunately, in the Obama administration, prosecution of gun crimes is down 30%. In my view, that's unacceptable. We should be focused on stopping violent criminals, and we should be prosecuting gun crimes. And so this national Project Exile will target in particular 15 jurisdictions with the highest violent crime rates and 3 tribal jurisdictions with the highest rates. And it provides $15 million a year for 3 years, $45 million for more resources on the ground to prosecute violent gun crimes. That's where our resources should be focused. In the wake of the Newtown shooting, very little attention in the media has been paid to the fact that President Obama cut funding for school safety by over $300 million. When you see the tragedy of little children senselessly murdered, the natural place to look is what are the school safety resources, what are we doing to protect our kids, and why did the president's budget cut over $300 million from school safety? This bill restores that funding, and in particular provides $300 million, $30 million a year for 10 years for Secure Our Schools grants to put resources in the schools protecting the safety of our kids. Additionally, this bill focuses on making the background system work better, providing incentives, providing penalties to encourage states to report mental health records. One of the consistent and tragic aspects of these mass shootings we have seen is over and over again they have involved individuals with serious mental illnesses. And unfortunately, the current background check system depends upon states to participate, and yet 18 states have submitted 100 or fewer records, mental health records, to the background check system. If you don't have states submitting their records, the background check system we have in place today cannot operate correctly, and so this reauthorizes funds to help states do that and increases the penalties for noncompliance. At the same time that this is increasing our resources to prosecute violent criminals, to target those who are a threat to innocence, this bill protects the fundamental right to keep and bear arms of law-abiding citizens. This bill does not go down the path of the Democrat bill that is on the floor of the Senate. And I would note that that bill, the Democrat bill that is also scheduled for a vote today, does not provide additional resources to prosecution, to targeting violent criminals. Instead, what it would do is expand the burden, the paperwork, the cost, and federal government oversight to private transactions between law-abiding citizens. That is not a sensible allocation of resources, and it's not a step that is consistent with protecting a critical part of the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment, right to keep and bear arms. That's what this bill endeavors to do, and I believe it is a serious step forward to combating violent crime, to stopping violent criminals, and to protecting the most vulnerable among us. Senator Graham.
Very quickly, and we'll definitely want to get your questions. This debate is probably good for the country without any doubt in my mind. Senators are going to cast votes over the next couple of days about what we think is the right solution to a very difficult problem. So Senator Begich, Pryor, Flake, and myself introduced legislation 3 or 4 weeks ago to deal with a situation that occurred in South Carolina. Many of you may remember this. Alice Boland was a paranoid schizophrenic young lady who has led a very troubled life. In 2005, she pled not guilty by reason of insanity of trying to kill President Bush and a Secret Service agent, was ordered into a mental health facility by the federal judge as part of the plea agreement. And in 2013, this year in February, she went to Waldoboro, South Carolina to purchase a .22 semi-automatic pistol. She filled out the paperwork, passed a background check, because her adjudication of not guilty by reason of insanity did not make it into the system. She took the gun to a private school, Ashley Hall, pulled out the weapon, pointed it at the staff, and the gun did not fire. So that got everybody in Charleston and myself thinking, what is it about background checks that we can obviously make more efficient? So a bipartisan group, our bill is in this proposal thanks to Senator Grassley and Cruz and others. It will be part of this package, and we're redefining adjudications to capture these type cases. We're making sure there are probably up to 1 million, they tell me, of adjudications at the state level where people have been rendered dangerous to themselves and others that are not into the background system. There are over 14,000 in South Carolina. We're tying a condition to the federal grant money that you have to submit mental health records to the background system to get the law enforcement grants in the future. It really is a stick, not a carrot. But to all those states, particularly the 18 who have submitted 100, you're doing the country a great disservice by not enrolling into the system people who've been found by a competent court with due process to be dangerous to themselves and others. And when you look at the Connecticut situation, this young man killed his mother. That's how he got the guns. And he wasn't adjudicated to danger to himself or others, but he was clearly troubled. The Virginia Tech situation, maybe under this new legislation, we could have captured that guy. As Ted said, we're trying to deal with violent criminals, but most of these cases where you have mass shootings are some very disturbed person without a long criminal record. So we're trying to do two things. We're trying to take it to the violent criminal rather than taking it to the innocent Second Amendment law-abiding citizen. And we're trying to create a process to enroll into the background check system someone who is a danger to themselves or others with due process considerations on their behalf. I'm very proud of this legislation. I think it will advance the cause, and I am confident, end of the day, this bill will get bipartisan support. And I just want to thank Senator Grassley for putting together a package that we all can rally around.
Thank you. Go ahead, Senator Bowles.
Well, I woke up this morning knowing that my 8 grandchildren were on their way to school. And I think we've all been touched by what happened in Newtown, the mass shootings that have taken place on college campuses and other incidences. But yet we have to recognize that no one particular bill or amendment solves the entire problem. But I don't question the motives of any of the 100 senators who I think share all of our feelings that we want to do what we sensibly can and reasonably can to address this problem from a legislative standpoint. I think it's very healthy that the country's having this debate right now because we're all searching our thoughts and souls and thinking about not just legislation, but what we as individuals, as families, as communities can do to address whether it's mental illness, whether it's criminals' access to illegal weapons. And I find this bill the most sensible in terms of balancing the rights of law-abiding citizens and really going after those, as Senator Cruz said, really going after those who are violating that system and have found ways to bypass it and needs to be addressed. So this combination of reasonable measures which don't violate the Second Amendment but also strengthen the efforts to improve a current check system that is incomplete under existing law, as also deal with some school safety issues. We don't have all the answers there, but we want to get some answers as to how we can best do that, and deal with the mental health issues that are important component of all of this. So I'm happy to join this effort. I have looked and studied at the various proposals that are before us, and I find this one to be the most effective and the most balanced in terms of maintaining those constitutional rights for law-abiding citizens that possess firearms, but also going after those that have violated those rights in many, many ways through bypassing the system or through an incomplete system, of whether it's prosecution or whether it's identification.
Each of us will take questions now.
Senator Cruz, one of the reasons that was given for the filibuster on the motion to proceed last week was that there was not enough time to review the legislation that he looked at. This bill is being introduced 6 hours before the Senate is set to vote on it. Isn't that, a bit of a double standard?
Well, this bill is a bill that has been circulated among a number of members, and we have not heard any complaints from any members right now about the timing of it.
Any of them Democrats?
That we have had conversations with several Democrats, and I share Senator Graham's confidence that when this bill is voted upon, that it is likely to receive significant bipartisan support. The votes today are also subject to a 60-vote threshold, and the point that I and several others made with regard to the filibuster was that, in our opinion, any bill that would potentially violate Second Amendment rights or any provision of the Bill of Rights should be subject to.
Senator Cruz, you talked in your remarks that much of this debate about guns is in response to Newtown. Do you think that those who had victims who were wounded or killed at Newtown could support your piece of legislation?
I'm certainly not going to purport to speak for anyone else. What I can say is, if the objective is stopping violent crime, on any fair and objective comparison, this legislation will do substantially more to stop violent crime than will the pending legislation on the floor of the Senate right now. This legislation is targeted at stopping violent crime, which it should be, and I think is, everyone's ultimate objective. And this legislation, the way to stop violent crime is to stop violent criminals. That's what this legislation is addressed to doing.
That's a good question. I'm going to take our bill, the Begich-Graham prior Flake bill, and make it a separate amendment. I think this package, I hope that people could support it who have been victims of horrific crimes like Newtown. I really do think it will go a long way to helping the current system be more effective. But the mental health component of this, we all know that this is a complicated endeavor, but I think every American should, one, want a felon on the run who fails a background check to be prosecuted and put back in jail. Surely we should be able to prosecute the dumbest criminals in America. There are 9,000 people last year who filled out a background check form who were felons on the run from the law. You know, we should be able to pick those folks up for God's sakes. But when it comes to almost 1 million people who've been adjudicated by a competent court, and I don't know if that's an accurate number. They tell me it's just a massive number. I know in South Carolina it's 14,000. And if 18 states have just submitted 100 names under the mental health adjudication system, something's wrong here. So we're going to have a freestanding amendment, a vote on the floor of the United States Senate that would encourage states to enroll into the background system people that have been adjudicated in their own state by their competent courts, by a court within that state, to be a danger to themselves and others. I hope that can pass. If that can't pass, something's really wrong in America. If we can't get votes to enroll people into a background check system who have been found a danger to themselves and others by a competent court at the state level, then this place really is dysfunctional.
One of the things you brought up in your opposition to the background checks bill is the possibility of creating a national gun registry. You've heard this from many others as well. The bill, as far as I can see, prohibits that and creates a 15-year prison sentence for any officer who tries to do that. Could you talk about how that might happen?
I think the bill that is pending on the floor of the Senate is the wrong approach to stopping violent crime. What that bill does is targets law-abiding citizens rather than violent criminals, and in particular, it substantially regulates private gun sales. If you decide you want to sell your shotgun and you put an advertisement in Craigslist, under that bill, before you can do so, you have to go through the federal government background check before engaging in a purely private transaction with another private citizen, two law-abiding citizens. Now, the consequence of doing that is on multiple levels. Number one, it increases the burden on law-abiding citizens to go through the background check. Number two, it increases the cost, because the way the currently pending bill is structured, the firearms dealer that would be conducting the background check can charge a fee. That fee is not determined. I would point out the District of Columbia right now charges $150 for a background check. So if the fee was anything like the fee that the District of Columbia has set up, that is, in effect, putting $150 government-imposed cost on your selling your shotgun to another private citizen. Beyond that, it's focusing attention on the wrong problem. The problem is not two law-abiding citizens engaging in a private transaction between firearms. The problem is violent criminals. And so it is misdirecting law enforcement resources. And the question of a national gun registry, I don't disagree that on its face, the currently pending legislation does not purport to create a national gun registry. But the Department of Justice has been explicit that when you require background checks for private firearms transactions, the only way to make that effective is through a national gun registry. So if the bill that is pending on the floor of the Senate passed, the next step in the process would be that critics would say, well, this isn't effective. We don't know if you're selling your firearm to someone else unless we know you have your firearm. And in my judgment, a federal registry of firearms, the federal government keeping a list of every firearm that is lawfully owned by every law-abiding citizen, would be terrible policy and would be inconsistent with the Constitution, just as would a federal registry listing every book owned by law-abiding citizens. Books are protected by the First Amendment, firearms are protected by the Second Amendment, and the federal government should not be restricting the constitutional liberties of law-abiding citizens. Instead, if the objective is not to create a registry, if the objective is to stop violent crime, there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that a private transaction between two law-abiding citizens poses any threat whatsoever. The threat is coming from violent criminals and from those with significant mental illnesses, and that's why this legislation targets prosecution resources to those individuals.
Senator, follow up on that. You talked about not wanting violent criminals to be able to have guns. It's sort of been the theme we've heard from you guys. There's changes to the current system, but you've been adamantly opposed to any expansion into closing the gun show loophole, which is a big topic of discussion here. How do you know that the guy selling his gun on Craigslist or the person buying a gun at a gun show isn't a violent criminal? And if your determination is to stop them, why are they different because they buy the gun in a different way?
Well, one of the things we discovered in the many hearings of the Judiciary Committee was what the evidence shows about where guns used in the commission of crimes come from. And what the evidence provides is that fewer than 2% of the firearms that are used in crimes are purchased at gun shows. Today, there is no, quote, so-called gun show loophole. Every federally licensed firearms dealer who sells a gun at a gun show has to conduct a background check, whether they sell it at a gun show or they sell it in their shop. What there is private citizens engaged in a private consensual transaction are not obligated to go to the federal government and go through federal government approval before engaging in that private transaction. That's the current state of the law. And if the objective is to stop violent crime, one of the consistent themes we heard at hearing after hearing was the theme of limited law enforcement resources, where when asked, why is it out of 48,000 felons and fugitives who tried to illegally purchase a gun, why did the Obama Justice Department prosecute only 44 of them? The answer that was given was, well, we don't have the time, the resources, we lack the resources to do that. If that's the case, let's provide the resources. I think it is a far more sensible step, if the goal is stopping violent crime, to go after felons that are trying to illegally buy guns than it is putting this massive new burden on law-abiding citizens whom the data show are not posing any significant threat.
Is the bill supported by the
follow up on
IRAs?
that, though? The question, simply put, is you repeatedly use the phrase law-abiding citizens. How do you know they're law-abiding citizens if, as the other side claims, 40% of sales don't go through a background check? How do you know they're law-abiding citizens?
Well, let me point out that 40% statistic is a very dubious statistic. It is a study that was done with a tiny sample size and was conducted largely before the background check system that exists today was in place. So that number is as close to junk science as any number you can put out. The way our system of justice works, every individual is presumed innocent. There is a distinction between felons. If you commit a felony, if you are convicted by a jury of your peers, you forfeit rights. You forfeit rights to your liberty. You can be incarcerated. You can forfeit the right to your life and be executed. And you can forfeit your right to exercise Second Amendment rights. The current federal law makes it illegal for felons to be in possession of firearms. And that's the consequence of our legal system adjudicating someone guilty of a felony, violating the law. That's where our resources, I think, need to be focused. And let me suggest, the president has had a great many news conferences focusing on this issue and making strong emotional pitches for action on this issue. Objectively speaking, this legislation does far more to prevent violent crime than anything that's currently pending on the floor of the Senate. And I would suggest 3 questions that I would hope the next time the President addresses this issue that our friends who are gathered here today may ask. The first question I would suggest you might consider asking the President is, if this is such a priority, why has the Obama Justice Department not prosecuted felons and fugitives who try to illegally buy guns? And in particular, in 2010, out of 48,000 felons and fugitives, why did the Obama Justice... A second question I would suggest you might consider asking, if this is such a high priority in the administration, why has the Obama Justice Department decreased prosecution of gun crimes by 30%? And the third question I would suggest you might consider asking is, if this is such a critical priority, why did the Obama administration cut funding for school safety by over $300 million? All of those go to the heart of the problem. What this legislation seeks to do is avoid the partisan bickering in Washington and try to take a positive, constructive, cooperative step to solve the problem, to make a positive step towards reducing violent crime, which I think should be everyone's objective. And it is my hope, on the merits, I think this bill should receive the votes of all 100 senators. I think that is unlikely. Well, I'm going to refrain from prognostication. Whether that bill passes or fails, or any other bill passes or fails, is up to 100 duly elected senators. What I can say is, if at the end of the day we see legislation that would have restricted Second Amendment rights voted down, and if at the end of the day we see legislation that will increase prosecutions and resources targeting violent criminals, that will be a victory for everyone. That will be a victory for the Second Amendment. It will be a victory for law-abiding citizens. It will be a victory for victims of violent crime. And it will be a victory for everyone that wants to see this problem addressed. I am hopeful that will be the outcome of this.
If after this exercise, almost 1 million people who have been adjudicated a danger to themselves or others by a state court are not into the background system, we failed. I'll just say that. I would be very disappointed if the Senate can't rise to the occasion and get that part of it done. The President wanted 3 things done. He wanted to ban assault weapons, he wanted to limit magazine sizes, and he wanted to impose a universal background check. Well, all 3 of those concepts are going to be on the floor of the United States Senate for a vote, and they're all going to lose. Why? Because they're not the solution to the problem we all face. I own an AR-15. If there's a situation where there's a natural disaster or there's a lawless environment, I would argue that an AR-15 is a better defense weapon than a double-barrel shotgun. Me and the Vice President have that ongoing debate. He tells his wife, who's a wonderful lady, he told some young man in San Francisco, if you have another earthquake in San Francisco, the best way to defend your home is have a double-barrel shotgun, not an AR-15. I respectfully disagree. You may not agree with me, but I think that's a reasonable position. As to magazine sizes, 10-round clips. The best way to interrupt the shooter is to have a police officer in the school to stop him. That's the best way to interrupt a shooter. What about the situation 2 months ago where a young woman was at home alone with her twin daughters, and a guy just out of jail broke into the home, terrorizing her family? She ran up to the closet, hid in the closet, was on the cell phone to her husband about what to do, took a .38 revolver. When the guy broke into the closet, she shot him 5 times, emptied the gun, had 6 rounds. In that case, it wouldn't bother me one bit for her to have 30 rounds. But some mentally unstable person or a violent criminal, I don't want them to have 1 bullet. So in a situation like that, the magazine limitation doesn't make sense to the mother. In Newtown, Connecticut, it doesn't make sense for that guy to have any bullets or any guns at all. So my hope is that when this is done, that the President's been all over the country wanting a vote. Well, he's going to get a vote. And as Ted said, when it comes to forcing the law, they've been woefully inadequate. It's all talk and no action by this administration. They've tried to create a political point on this. They've pushed this for political reasons, and it's going to go down because substantively what they're proposing doesn't address the problem.